The story of England isn't just about kings and queens or tea and crumpets. It's about how a collection of warring tribes became the most influential nation in human history, and how their legacy still shapes every aspect of your daily life right now. From Roman invaders to Viking raiders, from medieval knights to industrial revolutionaries, from world wars to modern monarchy, England's journey is packed with more plot twists than any Hollywood blockbuster. We're talking about a nation that survived the Black Death, executed their own king, burned witches, built the world's first railways, and somehow managed to maintain a 1,000-year-old monarchy that still exists today. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about English history. Every major turning point, every seemingly small decision, every random event we'll explore today directly led to the world you're living in right now. The language you're hearing, the legal system protecting you, the democratic ideals you take for granted, even the way you think about individual rights and freedoms, all trace back to events that happened on this one island nation. So, buckle up, because we're about to take the ultimate time machine journey through English history. We'll witness brutal invasions, political revolutions, religious upheavals, and cultural transformations that changed everything. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why England's story is actually your story too. Let's start at the very beginning, back when England wasn't even called England, and the people living there had no idea they were about to become part of the most dramatic historical saga ever written. Before the Romans arrived in 43 AD, the British Isles were home to Celtic tribes who lived in a world of druids, hill forts, and warrior culture. These weren't primitive people. They were skilled metalworkers, farmers, and traders who had established complex societies across the landscape. But their world was about to be turned completely upside down. When the Roman legions landed on the beaches of southern Britain, they brought more than just military might. They brought roads, cities, bathhouses, and a completely new way of organizing society. For nearly 400 years, southern Britain became a Roman province called Britannia. The Romans built Hadrian's Wall to keep out the fierce Scottish tribes, established major cities like Londinium, and created the infrastructure that would shape the island for centuries to come. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Romans didn't just conquer, they transformed. They introduced Christianity, established legal systems, and created the first unified administration of the region. When the Roman Empire began to crumble in the 5th century and the legions withdrew, they left behind a Romanized British population that was about to face their greatest challenge yet. The departure of the Romans created a massive power vacuum, and into this chaos came wave after wave of Germanic invaders. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the North Sea and began establishing kingdoms across what we now call England. This is literally where the name England comes from, the land of the Angles. These Anglo-Saxon kingdoms spent the next few centuries fighting each other for dominance while simultaneously fighting off Viking raids from the north. The Anglo-Saxon period gave England some of its most legendary figures and foundational stories. We're talking about King Arthur, whether he was real or mythical, who became the symbol of resistance against foreign invasion. We see the emergence of epic poems like Beowulf, which captured the warrior culture of the time. And we witness the gradual conversion to Christianity, which would become absolutely crucial to English identity. But the Anglo-Saxons faced their own existential threat. Starting in the late 8th century, Viking longships began appearing along English coasts. And these weren't just raids anymore. The Vikings were coming to stay. They conquered huge portions of northern and eastern England, establishing what became known as the Danelaw. For generations, English kingdoms fought desperately against these Scandinavian invaders. This is where one of England's greatest heroes emerges. Alfred the Great of Wessex didn't just fight the Vikings, he outsmarted them. He built a network of fortified towns called burhs, reorganized the military, and most importantly, he began the process of unifying the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into something that looked like England. Alfred also promoted learning and literacy, translating important works into Old English and laying the groundwork for English culture. Alfred's descendants continued his work, gradually pushing back the Vikings and unifying the English kingdoms. By the early 11th century, England had become a unified kingdom under rulers like Edgar the Peaceful and Ethelred the Unready. But just when it seemed like England had finally found stability, everything changed again in the most dramatic way possible. The year 1066 represents the ultimate turning point in English history. When Edward the Confessor died without an heir, multiple claimants fought for the English crown. Harold Godwinson was crowned king, but he immediately faced invasions from two directions. First, Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded the north, and Harold defeated him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But while Harold was fighting in Yorkshire, William of Normandy landed in the south with a massive invasion force. The Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, changed everything. Harold's exhausted army, fresh from their victory in the north, faced William's well-rested Norman cavalry and archers. When Harold fell with an arrow to the eye, Anglo-Saxon England died with him. William the Conqueror had won England, and nothing would ever be the same. The Norman conquest represents one of the most complete transformations in European history. William didn't just change the ruling class, he revolutionized English society from top to bottom. The Normans brought feudalism, castle building, and a completely new administrative system. They replaced Anglo-Saxon nobles with Norman lords, introduced Norman French as the language of the court, and began the process of creating medieval England. But here's what makes this so fascinating. The Norman conquest created a unique hybrid culture that was neither fully English nor fully French. Over the next few centuries, Norman French evolved into Middle English, combining Germanic Anglo-Saxon roots with Latin and French vocabulary. This linguistic fusion is why English today has such a rich and complex vocabulary, with multiple words for the same concept, depending on their historical origins. The Normans also transformed English architecture, law, and religion. They built massive stone castles and cathedrals that still dominate the English landscape today. They introduced new legal concepts that would eventually evolve into English common law. And they strengthened ties with continental Europe while simultaneously creating a distinctly English identity that was separate from both France and the rest of Britain. The medieval period that followed the Norman conquest was an era of incredible drama and transformation. We're talking about larger-than-life personalities like Henry II, who created an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. His conflict with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, culminated in Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral, turning him into a martyr and creating one of medieval Europe's most important pilgrimage sites. Then came the legendary Richard the Lionheart, who spent most of his reign fighting in the Crusades rather than ruling England. His absence and the misrule of his brother John led to one of the most important moments in constitutional history. In 1215, rebellious barons forced John to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede, establishing the principle that even kings were subject to law. The Magna Carta might seem like just an old document, but its influence on your life today cannot be overstated. It established concepts like due process, trial by jury, and protection from arbitrary imprisonment that became cornerstones of legal systems around the world. When American colonists later rebelled against British rule, they cited the Magna Carta as justification for their rights as Englishmen. Medieval England also saw the emergence of Parliament as a counterbalance to royal power. What started as a way for kings to raise taxes gradually evolved into a genuine legislative body. By the late 13th century, Parliament included not just nobles and clergy, but also representatives from towns and counties. This was the beginning of representative government that would eventually spread across the globe. But medieval England wasn't all about politics and constitutional development. This was also the era of incredible cultural flowering. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, giving us vivid glimpses of medieval English society. Gothic architecture reached its peak with cathedrals like Westminster Abbey and York Minster, and English began to emerge as a literary language in its own right, separate from Latin and French. The later medieval period brought unprecedented challenges that tested English society to its limits. The Black Death arrived in 1348, killing perhaps a third of the population and completely disrupting social and economic structures. Labor became scarce, wages rose, and the rigid feudal system began to crack. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, showed that common people were no longer willing to accept their traditional subordinate status. Meanwhile, England was fighting the 100 Years' War with France, a conflict that lasted from 1337 to 1453 and shaped English national identity in profound ways. Early English victories at Crécy and Agincourt, immortalized by Shakespeare centuries later, created a sense of English military superiority and divine favor. The longbow became a symbol of English prowess, and figures like the Black Prince became national heroes. But the Hundred Years' War also ended in defeat and humiliation for England, with the loss of almost all English territories in France. This setback, combined with the trauma of the Black Death and social upheaval, set the stage for the most dramatic internal conflict in English history: the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses, fought between 1455 and 1487 between the houses of Lancaster and York, represented the ultimate medieval power struggle. These weren't just dynastic conflicts, they were battles for the soul of England itself. The White Rose of York versus the Red Rose of Lancaster became symbols of competing visions for English governance and society. The wars produced some of the most controversial figures in English history. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, has been portrayed as everything from a monstrous child killer to a misunderstood reformer. His defeat at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 by Henry Tudor ended the medieval period and began the Tudor dynasty that would transform England once again. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth was more than just another dynastic change. It represented the beginning of the early modern period in English history. Henry married Elizabeth of York, symbolically uniting the warring roses and ending decades of civil war. But more importantly, he began the process of centralizing royal power and creating the modern English state. The Tudor period, lasting from 1485 to 1603, was perhaps the most transformative era in English history. Henry VIII, who reigned from 1509 to 1547, didn't just want a male heir, he revolutionized English religion and politics in his quest to divorce Catherine of Aragon. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry broke with Rome entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation wasn't just about Henry's marital problems. It was a complete transformation of English society, politics, and culture. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands redistributed to create a new class of Protestant nobility. Ancient religious traditions were abandoned or transformed. England became a Protestant nation in a largely Catholic Europe, setting up conflicts that would last for centuries. But the real genius of the English Reformation was how it tied religious identity to national identity. Being English increasingly meant being Protestant, and being Catholic meant being potentially treacherous and foreign. This religious nationalism would shape English foreign policy, domestic politics, and cultural identity well into the modern era. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, represents the pinnacle of Tudor achievement. The Elizabethan age was a time of incredible cultural flowering, maritime expansion, and growing national confidence. This was the era of Shakespeare and Marlowe, of Drake and Raleigh, of the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the beginning of English colonization of North America. Elizabeth's reign also saw the emergence of England as a major European power and the beginning of English naval supremacy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 wasn't just a military victory. It was a sign that Protestant England could stand up to Catholic Spain and win. English privateers like Francis Drake became national heroes for their raids on Spanish treasure ships and colonies. The Elizabethan period also marked the beginning of English involvement in the Atlantic slave trade and colonization of the Americas. While these activities seemed minor at the time, compared to Spanish and Portuguese empires, they laid the groundwork for England's later imperial expansion. The failed colony at Roanoke and the successful establishment of Jamestown in Virginia marked England's entry into the competition for global empire. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended and the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This Stuart accession united the English and Scottish crowns for the first time and began a new phase of English constitutional development. James believed in the divine right of kings and frequently clashed with Parliament over money, religion, and royal prerogatives. The early 17th century saw growing tension between royal authority and parliamentary power, between high church Anglicanism and Puritan reforms, between traditional social hierarchies and emerging capitalist economics. These tensions came to a head during the reign of James's son, Charles I, who ruled from 1625 to 1649. Charles I's attempts to rule without parliament, his religious policies, and his financial demands created unprecedented opposition. When he tried to arrest 5 members of parliament in 1642, the constitutional crisis erupted into civil war. England was about to experience something almost unthinkable: the execution of their king and the establishment of a republic. The English Civil Wars, fought between 1642 and 1651, were among the most important conflicts in world history. This wasn't just about who would rule England, it was about fundamental questions of government, religion, and individual rights that would influence political development across the globe. The parliamentarian victory led by Oliver Cromwell represented the triumph of representative government over absolute monarchy. But the English Republic, or Commonwealth, lasted only 11 years. Cromwell's military dictatorship proved that getting rid of kings didn't automatically mean getting freedom. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, England had learned that both absolute monarchy and military rule had serious problems. The solution was to create a limited monarchy with strong parliamentary controls. The Restoration period saw incredible scientific and cultural achievement. This was the era of Isaac Newton, Christopher Wren, and the founding of the Royal Society. London was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666, with magnificent churches and public buildings. Trade and commerce expanded dramatically, laying the foundations for England's later economic dominance. But religious and constitutional problems persisted. When Charles II's Catholic brother, James II, became king in 1685, his attempts to restore Catholicism and absolute rule created another crisis. The solution came in 1688, with the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament invited the Protestant William of Orange to take the throne, forcing James to flee. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was perhaps the most important bloodless coup in history. It established parliamentary supremacy, religious toleration for Protestants, and constitutional limits on royal power. The Bill of Rights of 1689 guaranteed parliamentary control over taxation, regular elections, and protection from arbitrary royal actions. These principles would later inspire democratic movements around the world. The Act of Union in 1707 formally united England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, creating the political entity that would soon dominate global affairs. But even more importantly, the post-1688 political settlement created the stability and prosperity that made the Industrial Revolution possible. The 18th century saw Great Britain emerge as the world's dominant naval and commercial power. Success in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, gave Britain control of North America and India, while the Royal Navy controlled the world's sea lanes. British merchants dominated global trade in everything from tea and spices to cotton and slaves. But Britain's very success created new problems. The American colonies, protected by British military might and enriched by British trade, began to chafe under British taxation and regulation. The principle of no taxation without representation, ironically derived from English constitutional tradition, became the rallying cry of American independence. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 was a devastating blow to British pride and prestige. But in many ways, American independence forced Britain to look beyond the Atlantic and develop the even larger empire in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific that would define the 19th century. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars from 1792 to 1815 tested British resolve and resources to their limits. But British naval supremacy, financial strength, and ability to form coalitions ultimately triumphed. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 confirmed British control of the seas, while the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 ended the Napoleonic threat forever. The early 19th century also saw the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain and transformed human civilization. Steam engines, textile factories, railways, and new forms of organization created unprecedented wealth and power, while also creating new forms of poverty and social problems. The Reform Act of 1832 began the gradual expansion of voting rights and parliamentary representation that would eventually create modern democracy. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 showed how moral and economic arguments could combine to create major social change. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 established free trade as a central principle of British policy. The Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901, represented the peak of British global dominance. At its height, The British Empire controlled about a quarter of the world's land surface and population. British industry, commerce, and finance dominated the global economy. British political and legal institutions spread across continents, and British culture, from literature to sports, influenced societies around the world. But the Victorian era also saw growing challenges to British supremacy. The rise of Germany and the United States as industrial powers, the emergence of new nationalisms within the British Empire, and social problems at home all suggested that British dominance might not last forever. The two world wars of the 20th century confirmed these fears. Although Britain emerged victorious from both conflicts, the economic and human costs were enormous. The empire began to dissolve as colonies gained independence. Britain's role as a global superpower passed to the United States and Soviet Union. The post-war period saw the creation of the welfare state, the loss of empire, and Britain's gradual integration into European institutions. The social revolution of the 1960s, economic crises of the 1970s, and conservative revival of the 1980s all reflected Britain's struggle to find a new role in the modern world. Today's United Kingdom faces new challenges around Brexit, Scottish independence, and its place in an increasingly complex global order. But the story of England, from Roman province to global empire to modern democracy, remains one of the most extraordinary transformations in human history. The legacy of English history shapes your world today in countless ways. The English language has become the global lingua franca. English legal traditions influence justice systems worldwide. Democratic ideas that emerge from centuries of English constitutional development remain ideals that people fight for around the globe. So, the next time you vote in an election, speak English, or expect due process in court, remember that you're experiencing the latest chapter in a story that began over 2,000 years ago on a small island in the North Atlantic. England's history isn't just their story, it's the story of how our modern world came to be.